Good evening, dear listener, and welcome back to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we'll be exploring what historians consider to be the worst presidencies in United States history. As you relax and prepare for slumber, we'll examine the leadership missteps, scandals, and unfortunate circumstances that defined these troubled administrations. Before we begin, take a deep breath and settle in as we journey through some of America's most challenging political chapters. These stories aren't just about political failures, but about human flaws, impossible situations, and valuable lessons learned. I hope this historical narrative will not only educate you, but also provide the perfect backdrop for drifting peacefully off to sleep. Last but not least, please also consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video, but only if you truly enjoy it, and comment where you are listening from and which time it is there. It's always fascinating to hear all the different places you listen from. Enough talk from me. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and enjoy today's video. The soft glow of candlelight flickers across the ornate desk in the White House study, as you observe a tall, distinguished-looking man with neatly combed silver hair and a perpetually worried expression. This is James Buchanan, America's 15th president, and you're about to witness what many historians consider the most ineffective presidency in American history. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's gently ease into this historical slumber party, shall we? It's March 4, 1857, and the nation holds its breath as Buchanan takes the oath of office. The only president who never married, Buchanan arrives at the White House after serving as minister to Great Britain, returning to an America he barely recognizes teetering precariously on the edge of sectional crisis. You can almost feel the weight of the nation settling onto his reluctant shoulders. The fabric of his formal black suit rustles slightly as he shifts uncomfortably under the burden. I, James Buchanan, do solemnly swear. The words echo across the Capitol grounds. Little does anyone know these solemn words will usher in 4 years of indecision, paralysis, and national fracturing. Quite a bedtime story, isn't it? Don't worry, though the Republic eventually survives, even if Buchanan's reputation doesn't. You follow Buchanan into the executive mansion, watching as he settles into the daily routine of presidential life. His niece, Harriet Lane, serves as his hostess, orchestrating elegant dinners where crystal glasses clink softly against fine china. But beneath the genteel surface, the nation is falling apart, and the president's approach can best be described as studiously avoiding anything resembling decisive action. It's rather like watching someone try to ignore a house fire by rearranging the furniture. The Dred Scott decision lands on his desk just 2 days after his inauguration. Chief Justice Roger Taney's ruling effectively declares that African Americans have no rights that white men are bound to respect. Buchanan, having inappropriately corresponded with justices before the ruling, merely nods in approval. A simple matter of constitutional law, he murmurs, before turning to more pressing matters, like selecting new White House curtains. You watch him carefully fold the newspaper and set it aside, as if dismissing the moral catastrophe it represents. The softly ticking grandfather clock in the corner of the presidential study marks the passage of time tick, 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 much like the steady drumbeat of the approaching Civil War that Buchanan seems determined not to hear. The Constitution, he whispers to himself late at night, does not permit me to prevent secession. You wonder if he actually believes this, or if it's simply more comfortable than taking action. Kansas bleeds under the weight of pro-slavery and anti-slavery violence. The Lecompton Constitution, written by pro-slavery forces, crosses the president's desk. Despite clear evidence of fraud, Buchanan endorses it, splitting his own Democratic Party and alienating Stephen Douglas, the one man who might have helped hold the Union together. You watch his hands tremble slightly as he signs the documents, the candlelight catching the sheen of perspiration on his forehead. As economic panic strikes in 1857, Buchanan's response is as tepid as day-old tea. The government cannot and should not intervene, he declares, while banks fail and businesses shutter across the nation. You observe his evening ritual, a glass of Madeira wine, a comfortable chair by the fire, and the steady avoidance of presidential responsibility. Are you still awake? Good, because the worst is yet to come. The tensions between North and South intensify like a slowly building symphony of discord. Southern states begin contemplating secession, their whispers growing louder with each passing month. You watch as Buchanan receives reports, sighs heavily, and files them away. His cabinet disintegrates around him 3 secretaries of Treasury in a single term, an unparalleled record of administrative chaos. In the quiet evening hours, servants whisper about the president's growing isolation and indecision. By December 1860, as South Carolina votes to secede following Abraham Lincoln's election, Buchanan's response is a masterclass in presidential hand-wringing. While I have no right to coerce a state back into the Union, he muses aloud, staring out the window at the half-built Washington Monument, secession is unconstitutional. This paradoxical position, secession is illegal, but preventing it is also illegal, might lull you to sleep faster than counting sheep. As more states secede, federal forts and arsenals throughout the South fall into Confederate hands. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor becomes the focal point of national attention. Buchanan, with just weeks left in his term, decides the wisest course is to do nothing at all. You watch him carefully fold his hands in his lap, the epitome of presidential paralysis. The soft rustle of papers being shuffled from one pile to another becomes the soundtrack of a nation dissolving. On his final night in office, March 3, 1861, Buchanan reportedly tells President-elect Lincoln, "If you are as happy entering the presidency as I am leaving it, then you are a very happy man indeed." The irony hangs in the air like the lingering scent of cigar smoke. Buchanan retreats to his Pennsylvania estate, Wheatland, where he spends his remaining years attempting to defend his indefensible administration. You can almost hear the soft scratching of his quill as he pens his memoir, desperately trying to rehabilitate his place in history. As you drift towards sleep, consider that Buchanan faced a nearly impossible situation with the worst possible response: inaction. Perhaps his greatest achievement was simply handing over the broken nation to someone more capable of mending it. The soft whisper of history's judgment continues to rate him as America's worst president, a soothing reminder that even our darkest political moments eventually pass into memory. Now, let's turn the page and drift toward another presidential catastrophe, shall we? The candlelight flickers across a new face, now rugged, stern, with deep-set eyes that seem perpetually displeased. You've stepped into the turbulent presidency of Andrew Johnson, a man who rose from illiteracy to the highest office in the land, only to stumble at nearly every turn. Are you settled comfortably? Let's continue our gentle journey through presidential misfortune. It's April 15, 1865, and the nation is reeling from the unthinkable President Lincoln's assassination. In a small boarding house room not far from Ford's Theater, you witness a solemn, hastily arranged ceremony. Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase administers the oath of office to Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had been selected as Lincoln's running mate, merely to balance the ticket. The room smells of leather-bound books and anxiety. No one had planned for this moment, least of all Johnson himself. "I, Andrew Johnson, do solemnly swear." The words hang heavy in the air. The new president's hands tremble slightly, perhaps from the weight of responsibility, perhaps from something else entirely. You see, Johnson had appeared visibly intoxicated at his vice presidential inauguration just 6 weeks earlier, delivering a rambling, incoherent speech that mortified Lincoln and embarrassed the nation. Not the most auspicious beginning for the man now tasked with healing a wounded country. You follow Johnson through the White House, which still bears the invisible imprint of Lincoln's presence. The floorboards creak softly beneath your feet as Johnson paces at night, a self-taught tailor from Tennessee with a boulder-sized chip on his shoulder. His wife, Eliza, arranges his papers with quiet efficiency, whispering encouraging words that rarely seem to penetrate his stubborn demeanor. The grandfather clock in the hallway counts away the seconds of what will become one of America's most contentious presidencies. Johnson inherits a nation shattered by 4 years of bloody civil war. The South lies in ruins. 4 million formerly enslaved people await the fulfillment of freedom's promise, and Congress is dominated by radical Republicans with a vision of Reconstruction far different from Johnson's own. It's a political powder keg waiting for a match, and Johnson seems all too eager to strike one. Are you still comfortable? Let's pull the blanket of history a bit tighter around us. Initially, Johnson talks tough about treason and punishment. Treason must be made infamous, and traitors must be impoverished, he declares in the early days of his presidency. The radical Republicans nod in approval, assuming they have an ally. But like a weather vane in changing winds, Johnson's position shifts dramatically. You watch his face soften when former Confederate leaders come calling, hat in hand, seeking presidential pardons. Johnson, harboring deep sympathy for the South and an even deeper racial animus, begins dispensing pardons like candy at a parade. By summer's end in 1865, you observe Johnson implementing his own Reconstruction plan while Congress is in recess. Southern states are rapidly readmitted to the Union with minimal conditions. Former Confederate leaders return to power. And most troublingly, new black codes emerge across the South, effectively reimposing servitude in all but name. The soft rustling of these restrictive legal documents echoes through state legislatures like dry leaves skittering across a forgotten battlefield. When Congress reconvenes in December, the collision is immediate and spectacular. Radical Republicans refuse to seat representatives from Johnson's hastily reconstructed southern states. You watch Johnson's face redden with anger as he learns of the affront. "Those damn radicals," he mutters to his secretary, the soft scratch of his pen becoming more forceful as he writes yet another veto message. The sound of political compromise being torn asunder is surprisingly similar to that of paper being crumpled and tossed into a fire. The clash intensifies as Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, granting citizenship to all persons born in the United States. Johnson vetoes it. Congress overrides his veto, the first major legislation to be enacted over a presidential veto in American history. You witness Johnson's face twist with indignation. "The Constitution," he insists, though few are still listening. The pattern repeats with the Reconstruction Acts, the Tenure of Office Act, and the Command of the Army Act, all vetoed, all overridden. By 1867, Johnson's presidency has devolved into a sequence of political battles invariably lost. You observe him one evening, alone in the presidential study, a glass of whiskey in hand, muttering grievances against his congressional opponents. Outside the window, gas lamps illuminate a Washington growing and changing despite its president's resistance. The soft clink of his glass against the desk punctuates his isolation. Are your eyelids growing heavy yet? We're approaching the most dramatic moment of Johnson's troubled tenure. In February 1868, Johnson decides to remove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a Lincoln appointee sympathetic to the radical Republicans. The problem? The Tenure of Office Act specifically forbids him from doing so without Senate approval. You watch as Johnson, convinced of his constitutional authority, orders Stanton's dismissal anyway. Stanton refuses to leave, barricading himself in his office. The soft thud of the lock engaging on the War Department door becomes the opening salvo in America's first presidential impeachment. The House of Representatives votes to impeach Johnson on February 24, 1868 11 articles of impeachment, primarily centered on his violation of the Tenure of Office Act. You stand in the crowded Senate gallery during the trial, the largest political spectacle the nation has yet witnessed. Johnson does not attend, but his presence looms over the proceedings like a stubborn shadow. The gentle rustle of ladies' fans and gentlemen's programs creates a soft backdrop to the solemn constitutional drama. The trial lasts for weeks, with Representative Thaddeus Stevens delivering the closing argument from a chair, too ill to stand. When the Senate votes on May 16, 1868, the tension in the chamber is thick enough to cut with a knife. The final tally: 35 for conviction, 19 for acquittal. Johnson survives by a single vote, the narrowest of margins separating him from the historic disgrace of removal from office. You observe a small smile cross his face when he receives the news, not triumph, merely vindication. Johnson's remaining 10 months in office pass in political irrelevance. Denied his party's nomination for the 1868 election, he returns to Tennessee after Grant's inauguration. His political career isn't quite finished in a remarkable twist. Tennessee will send him back to the Senate in 1875, making him the only former president to later serve in the Senate. But his brief, tumultuous tenure as president stands as a testament to the dangers of accidental leadership and inflexible ideology. The soft closing of the White House door behind him seems to symbolize the nation's collective sigh of relief. As you drift closer to sleep, consider that Johnson's presidency, born in national tragedy, never escaped its inauspicious beginnings. His stubborn resistance to civil rights and inability to work with Congress delayed the healing of the nation's wounds. The soft whispers of "what might have been" haunt this chapter of American history. What if Lincoln had lived? What if a more temperate hand had guided Reconstruction? These questions, like gentle waves, can carry you towards slumber as we prepare to meet our next presidential misadventure. The scene shifts now, and gaslight gives way to electric bulbs illuminating the White House of the 1920s. You find yourself in a smoke-filled room where a strikingly handsome man with kind eyes and a bewildered expression sits at the presidential desk. This is Warren Gamaliel Harding, America's 29th president, whose administration would become synonymous with scandal and corruption. Are you cozy? Good. Let's explore this cautionary tale of charm without substance. It's March 4, 1921, and America is ready for what Harding has promised will be a return to normalcy after the tumultuous Wilson years and the Great War. The air is crisp with possibility as Harding delivers his inaugural address, his resonant voice carrying across the Capitol grounds. Women, newly enfranchised, have helped elect him by a landslide. You notice his wife, Florence, watching with a mixture of pride and concern. She knows better than most the limitations of the man now taking the oath of office. I, Warren G. Harding, do solemnly swear. The words are delivered with the perfect cadence of a former newspaper publisher accustomed to public speaking. Harding looks the part of a presidential, dignified, with silver hair and an engaging smile. It's a pity, really, that appearances can be so deceiving. You might find yourself drifting off to dreams of leadership based on substance rather than style. You follow Harding into the executive mansion, where he immediately seems overwhelmed by the responsibilities of the presidency. I am not fit for this office, and never should have been here, he confides to a journalist friend late one evening, the soft clink of whiskey glasses punctuating his moment of rare self-awareness. Despite prohibition being the law of the land, the White House maintains a well-stocked supply of liquor, and poker games with Harding's Ohio gang of cronies often stretch into the early morning hours. The gentle shuffle of cards and murmur of political deals being made becomes a familiar sound in the people's house. Harding's administration begins with some promising appointments: Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State, Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury, and Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce. But for each capable cabinet member, there seems to be a questionable friend from Ohio given a position of power. You observe Harding signing appointment papers with barely a glance, the fountain pen scratching across official documents with alarming casualness. "These are my friends," he explains simply when questioned about his choices. Friendship, a lovely quality in a neighbor, perhaps less ideal as the sole qualification for government service. Are you still awake? Let's watch as the scandals begin to unfold like a slow-motion cascade of administrative disasters. There's the Veterans Bureau, where Director Charles Forbes embezzles millions meant for hospitals serving wounded World War I veterans. The soft rustle of money changing hands under tables echoes through Washington corridors. Attorney General Harry Doherty's Justice Department becomes a marketplace for influence peddling. The gentle clink of bootlegged whiskey bottles being delivered to government offices under cover of darkness becomes commonplace. But the most infamous scandal waits in the Wing's Teapot Dome. Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, secretly leases naval oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, to private oil companies in exchange for personal loans. You watch Harding sign the executive order transferring the reserves from the Navy to the Interior Department with no apparent concern, the scratching of his pen on parchment, a prelude to what will become the greatest scandal in American politics until Watergate. Fall's sudden acquisition of expensive livestock and property improvements raises eyebrows, but Harding remains oblivious, telling reporters, "I have no trouble with my enemies. But my friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor at nights." While corruption flourishes around him, Harding himself appears more hapless than malicious. You observe him reading briefing papers with a furrowed brow, clearly struggling to comprehend complex policy matters. His solution is typically to delegate to others and retreat to more comfortable pursuits: golf, poker, and socializing. The soft thwack of a golf club, connecting with a ball on the White House lawn, becomes his administration's heartbeat. Harding's attention span for governance lasts about as long as a melting ice cube in a summer heatwave. Harding's personal life is equally complicated. Letters between the president and his longtime mistress, Carrie Phillips, contain passages that would make even modern political scandals seem tame. Another relationship with a young woman named Nan Britton produces a daughter, though this won't be confirmed until DNA testing in the 21st century. The soft closing of doors to private White House rooms speaks to presidential indiscretions that Florence Harding works tirelessly to keep from public view. Are your eyelids growing heavy? Political scandals throughout history have that soporific effect. By 1923, rumors of corruption begin reaching Harding's ears. "I have no trouble with my enemies," he laments again, the weight of betrayal evident in his voice. In a moment of uncharacteristic resolve, he decides to embark on a voyage of understanding, a cross-country speaking tour to reconnect with the American people. You watch him board the train, his face noticeably tired, his handshake lacking its usual vigor. The soft chugging of the presidential train pulling away from Washington seems to carry with it a sense of foreboding. On August 2, 1923, in San Francisco's Palace Hotel, Warren G. Harding's presidency comes to an abrupt end when he passes away suddenly. Official reports cite a stroke or heart attack, though rumors of other causes swirl for decades. Florence Harding refuses an autopsy and quickly has her husband's body returned to Washington. You watch as the nation mourns a president they knew little about, his casket carried with solemn dignity through the Capitol Rotunda. The soft footfalls of the honor guard echo against marble floors as citizens file past to pay respects. After Harding's passing, the full extent of his administration's corruption gradually comes to light. His reputation erodes with each new revelation. Secretary Fall becomes the first cabinet member in history to go to prison. The soft closing of a cell door symbolizes the end of an era of particularly brazen political corruption. Florence Harding burns many of her husband's papers before her own death in 1924, leaving historians to piece together the full story of his troubled presidency from what remains. As you drift towards sleep, consider that Harding's greatest failing may have been his own self-assessment. He was indeed not fit for the office he held. Sometimes the most damaging presidents are not those with malicious intent, but those with insufficient capacity for the role they've been given. The gentle lesson here might be that charm and good looks are poor substitutes for competence and character. Now, let's turn the page to another presidential portrait in our gallery of governmental misfortune. The setting changes once more, and you find yourself transported back to the 1850s, where gaslight casts gentle shadows across the worried face of a strikingly attractive man. With dark hair swept dramatically to the side and soulful eyes that hint at personal tragedy, Franklin Pierce cuts a dashing figure. America's 14th president is the very picture of a romantic hero, yet his presidency will prove to be anything but heroic. Are you settled comfortably? Let this tale of handsome ineffectiveness lull you toward dreamland. It's March 4, 1853, and Pierce stands on the Capitol steps to deliver his inaugural address from Memorino Mean Feet at over 3 words. The sky above is clear and bright, seeming to promise a presidency of equal clarity. At 48, Pierce is the youngest president yet elected, a charming Democrat from New Hampshire with a military background and an easy smile. You notice how the crowd responds to his youthful energy and optimism, unaware that beneath this polished exterior lies a man already acquainted with profound sorrow and prone to debilitating indecision. I, Franklin Pierce, do solemnly swear. The words are delivered with perfect diction and apparent conviction. What the audience doesn't see is the deep personal pain Pierce carries with him to the highest office. Just 2 months before his inauguration, Pierce, his wife Jane, and their only surviving son, 11-year-old Benny, were in a terrible train accident. Pierce and Jane survived, but young Benny did not. The soft rustle of Jane's black mourning clothes as she stands beside her husband speaks volumes about the grief that accompanies them to the White House. You follow the Pierces into the executive mansion, where Jane retreats to an upstairs bedroom, writing letters to her deceased son that she places beside her bed each night. The soft scratch of her pen across paper in the quiet hours becomes a heartbreaking ritual. Pierce, meanwhile, turns to governance with the distraction of a man fleeing personal demons. There's nothing left to do but to suppress every emotion and look fate in the face, he confides to a friend, the soft clink of his brandy glass punctuating his resignation. Pierce's administration begins with a promising cabinet, including future Confederate President Jefferson Davis as Secretary of War. But the new president, once described by Nathaniel Hawthorne as having a certain commonplace prosperity, quickly demonstrates a talent for making precisely the wrong decision at precisely the wrong time. You observe cabinet meetings where Pierce listens attentively, nodding in apparent understanding, then invariably chooses the path of least resistance, which is rarely the path of wisdom. The gentle tap of his fingers on the polished cabinet table becomes a tell for his growing anxiety. Are your eyelids growing heavy yet? Let's watch the most consequential failure of Pierce's presidency unfold with the fateful Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Pushed by Senator Stephen Douglas, this legislation repeals the Missouri Compromise and allows new territories to decide the slavery question by popular sovereignty. Pierce supports the bill enthusiastically, somehow missing that it will tear open the fragile national compromise on slavery that has held for a generation. The soft shuffling of papers as he signs the act belies its explosive impact. The results are immediate and disastrous. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces rush into Kansas, each determined to win the territory for their side. Bleeding Kansas becomes the proving ground for the violence that will eventually engulf the nation. You watch as reports of confrontations reach Pierce's desk, his handsome face increasingly drawn with worry. "More coffee, please," becomes his standard response to bad news, the gentle pouring of the dark liquid, a counterpoint to the darkness spreading across the national landscape. Pierce's foreign policy proves equally problematic. The Ostend Manifesto, a secret document suggesting the United States might seize Cuba from Spain, becomes public, embarrassing the administration and inflaming sectional tensions further. You observe Pierce at his desk, head in hands, as advisors explain the diplomatic fallout. The soft tick of the mantel clock measures out moments of a presidency increasingly defined by miscalculation. "I had hoped for better," he murmurs to no one in particular. By 1856, Pierce's Democratic Party has had enough. He becomes the first elected president denied renomination by his own party, a humiliation softened only by his own recognition of his failures. "There is nothing left to do but get drunk," he allegedly quips upon leaving office, though the humor masks genuine disappointment. You watch as he and the still grieving Jane prepare to leave the White House, servants gently packing away personal items that somehow seem fewer than when they arrived. Pierce's post-presidency spirals further downward. When the Civil War erupts a few years later, his criticisms of Lincoln's administration and his continued correspondence with Jefferson Davis lead many to question his loyalty. Franklin Pierce has become an old gentleman of the most harmless description, sneers one newspaper, the ultimate dismissal of a former commander-in-chief. The soft flutter of these newspapers being tossed aside mirrors the nation's dismissal of his legacy. In his final years, Pierce lives quietly in New Hampshire, increasingly isolated and turning to alcohol for comfort. When he passes away in 1869, the nation has largely forgotten him, focused instead on reconstruction, and healing the wounds of the war his weakness helped precipitate. You imagine the soft falling of snow on his New Hampshire grave, gradually covering the name of a president whose personal charm proved an inadequate substitute for leadership. As sleep draws nearer, consider that Pierce's presidency stands as a testament to the insufficiency of good intentions and personal appeal. His failure to rise above personal tragedy and provide moral leadership during a pivotal moment cost the nation dearly. The gentle lesson here might be that sometimes the most consequential failures are not actions but inactions, not what was done but what was left undone. Now, let your mind drift toward our next presidential portrait, as comfortable as your pillow and as soothing as this historical journey through executive inadequacy. It's April 15, 1865, and the nation is reeling from the unthinkable President Lincoln's assassination. In a small boarding house room not far from Ford's Theater, you witness a solemn, hastily arranged ceremony. Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase administers the oath of office to Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had been selected as Lincoln's running mate merely to balance the ticket. The room smells of leather-bound books and anxiety. No one had planned for this moment, least of all Johnson himself. "I, Andrew Johnson, do solemnly swear." The words hang heavy in the air. The new president's hands tremble slightly, perhaps from the weight of responsibility, perhaps from something else entirely. You see, Johnson had appeared visibly intoxicated at his vice-presidential inauguration just 6 weeks earlier, delivering a rambling, incoherent speech that mortified Lincoln and embarrassed the nation. Not the most auspicious beginning for the man now tasked with healing a wounded country. You follow Johnson through the White House, which still bears the invisible imprint of Lincoln's presence. The floorboards creak softly beneath your feet as Johnson paces at night, a self-taught tailor from Tennessee with a boulder-sized chip on his shoulder. His wife, Eliza, arranges his papers with quiet efficiency, whispering encouraging words that rarely seem to penetrate his stubborn demeanor. The grandfather clock in the hallway counts away the seconds of what will become one of America's most contentious presidencies. Johnson inherits a nation shattered by 4 years of bloody civil war. The South lies in ruins. 4 million formerly enslaved people await the fulfillment of freedom's promise. And Congress is dominated by radical Republicans, with a vision of Reconstruction far different from Johnson's own. It's a political powder keg waiting for a match, and Johnson seems all too eager to strike one. Are you still comfortable? Let's pull the blanket of history a bit tighter around us. Initially, Johnson talks tough about treason and punishment. Treason must be made infamous, and traitors must be impoverished, he declares in the early days of his presidency. The radical Republicans nod in approval, assuming they have an ally. But like a weather vane in changing winds, Johnson's position shifts dramatically. You watch his face soften when former Confederate leaders come calling, hat in hand, seeking presidential pardons. Johnson, harboring deep sympathy for the South and an even deeper racial animus, begins dispensing pardons like candy at a parade. By summer's end in 1865, you observe Johnson implementing his own Reconstruction plan while Congress is in recess. Southern states are rapidly readmitted to the Union with minimal conditions. Former Confederate leaders return to power. And most troublingly, new black codes emerge across the South, effectively reimposing servitude in all but name. The soft rustling of these restrictive legal documents echoes through state legislatures like dry leaves skittering across a forgotten battlefield. When Congress reconvenes in December, the collision is immediate and spectacular. Radical Republicans refuse to seat representatives from Johnson's hastily reconstructed southern states. You watch Johnson's face redden with anger as he learns of the affront. "Those damn radicals," he mutters to his secretary, the soft scratch of his pen becoming more forceful as he writes yet another veto message. The sound of political compromise being torn asunder is surprisingly similar to that of paper being crumpled and tossed into a fire. The clash intensifies as Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, granting citizenship to all persons born in the United States. Johnson vetoes it. Congress overrides his veto, the first major legislation to be enacted over a presidential veto in American history. You witness Johnson's face twist with indignation. "The Constitution," he insists, though few are still listening. The pattern repeats with the Reconstruction Acts, the Tenure of Office Act, and the Command of the Army Act, all vetoed, all overridden. By 1867, Johnson's presidency has devolved into a sequence of political battles invariably lost. You observe him one evening, alone in the presidential study, a glass of whiskey in hand, muttering grievances against his congressional opponents. Outside the window, gas lamps illuminate a Washington growing and changing despite its president's resistance. The soft clink of his glass against the desk punctuates his isolation. Are your eyelids growing heavy yet? We're approaching the most dramatic moment of Johnson's troubled tenure. In February 1868, Johnson decides to remove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a Lincoln appointee, sympathetic to the radical Republicans. The problem? The Tenure of Office Act specifically forbids him from doing so without Senate approval. You watch as Johnson, convinced of his constitutional authority, orders Stanton's dismissal anyway. Stanton refuses to leave, barricading himself in his office. The soft thud of the lock engaging on the War Department door becomes the opening salvo in America's first presidential impeachment. The House of Representatives votes to impeach Johnson on February 24, 1868. 11 articles of impeachment, primarily centered on his violation of the Tenure of Office Act. You stand in the crowded Senate gallery during the trial, the largest political spectacle the nation has yet witnessed. Johnson does not attend, but his presence looms over the proceedings like a stubborn shadow. The gentle rustle of ladies' fans and gentlemen's programs creates a soft backdrop to the solemn constitutional drama. The trial lasts for weeks, with Representative Thaddeus Stevens delivering the closing argument from a chair, too ill to stand. When the Senate votes on May 16, 1868, the tension in the chamber is thick enough to cut with a knife. The final tally: 35 for conviction, 19 for acquittal. Johnson survives by a single vote, the narrowest of margins separating him from the historic disgrace of removal from office. You observe a small smile cross his face when he receives the news, not triumph, merely vindication. Johnson's remaining 10 months in office pass in political irrelevance. Denied his party's nomination for the 1868 election, he returns to Tennessee after Grant's inauguration. His political career isn't quite finished in a remarkable twist. Tennessee will send him back to the Senate in 1875, making him the only former president to later serve in the Senate. But his brief, tumultuous tenure as president stands as a testament to the dangers of accidental leadership and inflexible ideology. The soft closing of the White House door behind him seems to symbolize the nation's collective sigh of relief. As you drift closer to sleep, consider that Johnson's presidency, born in national tragedy, never escaped its inauspicious beginnings. His stubborn resistance to civil rights and inability to work with Congress delayed the healing of the nation's wounds. The soft whispers of what might have been haunt this chapter of American history. What if Lincoln had lived? What if a more temperate hand had guided Reconstruction? These questions, like gentle waves, can carry you towards slumber as we prepare to meet our next presidential misadventure. The scene shifts forward in time, and electric lights now illuminate the White House of the late 1920s. A stern-faced man with round spectacles sits at the presidential desk, surrounded by charts, graphs, and economic reports stacked with meticulous precision. This is Herbert Hoover, America's 31st president, a brilliant mind about to collide with history's most unforgiving economic catastrophe. Are you feeling drowsy yet? Let this tale of technocratic overconfidence gently usher you toward dreamland. It's March 4, 1929, and Hoover's inauguration sparkles with the optimism of the Roaring Twenties. The air is crisp with possibility as he delivers his inaugural address, projecting absolute confidence in America's continued prosperity. "I have no fears for the future of our country," he declares, his voice carrying across the Capitol grounds. It is bright with hope. You notice the expensive automobiles lining Pennsylvania Avenue. The fashionable clothes of the spectators are all visible symbols of the prosperity that will soon vanish like morning mist. "I, Herbert Hoover, do solemnly swear." The words are delivered with the precise diction of an engineer accustomed to exactitude in all things. Hoover brings to the presidency a sterling, successful mining engineer, humanitarian hero who fed war-torn Europe, efficient Secretary of Commerce. The quintessential self-made man, orphaned at age 9, he rose through intelligence, discipline, and hard work to amass a fortune and an international reputation. The soft rustle of his perfectly tailored suit as he raises his right hand symbolizes the meticulous precision that has defined his life and will ultimately fail him as president. You follow Hoover into the executive mansion, watching as he immediately establishes systems and routines. He rises at 6:30 each morning for medicine ball exercises, with his cabinet members the soft thud of the heavy ball being tossed back and forth, a metaphor for how he views governance: orderly, predictable, mechanical. His wife, Lou Henry, equally accomplished and educated, organizes White House affairs with similar efficiency. The gentle ticking of numerous clocks throughout the mansion underscores the Hoovers' devotion to precision and schedules. The administration begins with ambitious plans for continued prosperity. "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land," Hoover declares in his acceptance speech. You observe cabinet meetings where the president speaks with authority about economic theories and principles, his finger tapping confidently on reports predicting continued growth. The soft shuffling of papers as officials take notes conveys complete faith in their leader's expertise. Are your eyelids growing heavy? History's irony can be quite soporific. Just 7 months into Hoover's presidency, on October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, the stock market crashes. 5 days later comes Black Tuesday, when the market loses 12% of its value in a single day. You watch Hoover receive the news, his engineer's mind immediately calculating, analyzing, seeking rational solutions to a crisis that defies rational response. The fundamental business of the country, that is, production and distribution of commodities, is on a sound and prosperous basis. he assures the public. The soft scratch of his fountain pen editing reassuring statements belies the economic abyss opening beneath the nation's feet. As 1930 unfolds, the Great Depression deepens like a slow-moving nightmare. Banks fail by the thousands, businesses shutter, unemployment soars. Hoover, wedded to his philosophy of rugged individualism, resists direct federal relief to suffering Americans. Prosperity cannot be restored by raids on the public treasury, he insists. You observe him working 18-hour days, convening conferences, creating committees, pursuing voluntary programs all, while steadfastly opposing handouts that might sap American self-reliance. The soft clack of his secretary's typewriter works overtime to document initiatives that prove vastly inadequate to the scale of the disaster. By 1931, shanty towns of homeless Americans are appearing across the country. They're called Hoovervilles, in bitter tribute to the president. Newspaper photographers capture images of former businessmen selling apples on street corners for 5 cents each. You watch Hoover receive daily reports, his face growing more careworn, his posture more rigid with each passing month. No one is actually starving, he tells reporters. The hobos are better fed than they have ever been. The soft rustle of increasingly desperate letters from citizens, piling up in White House mailrooms, contradicts his assessment. In the summer of 1932, the bonus army thousands of World War I veterans, seeking early payment of promised bonus, establishes a massive encampment in Washington. When violence erupts during their eviction, Hoover's reputation suffers another devastating blow. You observe him pacing in the Oval Office, angry and bewildered at being cast as uncaring when he has worked tirelessly to solve the crisis. The soft tread of his feet on the carpet traces patterns of frustration. The only trouble with capitalism, he once said, is capitalists. They're too greedy. Yet his solutions continue to prioritize business confidence over direct relief. The 1932 election becomes a referendum on Hoover's handling of the Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt offers a stark contrast with his ebullient confidence and promises of bold federal action. Hoover campaigns half-heartedly, often greeted by heckling crowds. The grass will grow in the streets of 100 cities, he warns about FDR's policies. On election night, you watch him receive the results in stoic silence. Roosevelt wins 42 states to Hoover's 6, one of the most lopsided defeats ever suffered by an incumbent president. The soft click of the telegraph machine delivering results seems to count down the final moments of his political career. The lame duck period proves excruciating as Hoover attempts to persuade Roosevelt to maintain his economic policies. FDR keeps his distance, refusing to commit to anything before inauguration. You observe Hoover on his final day in office, meticulously organizing his papers, leaving everything in precise order for his successor. The soft closing of desk drawers and filing cabinets punctuates the end of his presidency, a well-meaning technocrat overwhelmed by forces beyond his engineering calculations. In his post-presidency, Hoover lives for another 3 decades, gradually rehabilitating his reputation through humanitarian work and government service. He writes extensively, defending his record and perspective. When he passes away in 1964 at age 90, the nation remembers him more charitably than during the depths of the Depression. The soft flutter of flags lowered to half-staff honors a man whose greatest misfortune may have been confronting a crisis that his considerable talents and firmly held principles were precisely the wrong tools to address. As sleep beckons closer, consider that Hoover's presidency illustrates how even extraordinary competence in one sphere may not translate to another. The engineer who could calculate structural stresses to the decimal point couldn't navigate the human dimensions of economic catastrophe. The gentle lesson here might be that sometimes our greatest strengths, applied in the wrong context, become our most consequential weaknesses. Now, Let your thoughts drift toward our next presidential portrait as we continue our soothing journey through executive inadequacy. The setting shifts once more, and the warm glow of television cameras now illuminates the White House of the early 1970s. A dark-browed man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow sits hunched at the presidential desk, intelligence and suspicion radiating from him in equal measure. This is Richard Milhous Nixon, America's 37th president, a political genius whose greatest enemy would ultimately be himself. Are you nestled comfortably? Let this tale of brilliant self-destruction ease you towards slumber. It's January 20, 1969, and Nixon's inauguration represents an extraordinary political comeback. After losing the presidency to Kennedy in 1960 and the California governorship 2 years later, when he famously told reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," he has achieved what seemed impossible. You notice how he savors this moment of triumph, his wife Pat standing stoically beside him in the January chill. The air feels electric with possibility as he calls for a new era of unity. We cannot learn from one another until we stop shouting at one another. The irony of these words will reveal itself in time. I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear. The oath is delivered with the precise diction of a former debater. Nixon brings to the presidency a formidable intellect and unmatched political experience. Congressman, senator, vice president for 8 years under Eisenhower. The son of a grocer who rose through relentless work and ambition, he has reached the pinnacle of American politics. The soft rustle of his inaugural address pages turning represents the beginning of what might have been one of America's most consequential presidencies had his character matched his capabilities. You follow Nixon into the executive mansion, observing his curious blend of brilliance and awkwardness. He works late into the night, scribbling notes on yellow legal pads with ideas for foreign policy initiatives. The gentle scratch of his pen across paper at 2 a.m. speaks to his tireless work ethic. Yet he seems perpetually uncomfortable in social settings, struggling with small talk at official functions. "I'm an introvert in an extrovert's profession," he once confessed. His wife Pat moves through the White House with quiet dignity, maintaining perfect composure despite her distaste for political life. The soft click of her sensible heels on marble floors echoes her contained reserve. Nixon's administration begins with remarkable foreign policy achievements. You observe him hunched over maps with National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, planning the opening to China that will transform geopolitics. The soft murmur of their strategic conversations contrasts with the bold strokes of their diplomatic initiatives. Nixon's policy of détente with the Soviet Union leads to crucial arms limitation agreements. His gradual extraction of American forces from Vietnam, while controversial, ends direct U.S. involvement in a deeply divisive conflict. Are your eyelids growing heavy yet? There's something soothing about watching genuine political talent at work. Domestically, Nixon surprises many with his progressive policies. The Environmental Protection Agency is created under his administration. He proposes a universal health care plan more ambitious than anything achieved until decades later. You watch him sign legislation expanding Social Security and food stamps, his pen making soft scratching sounds on documents that belie his conservative reputation. "We are all Keynesians now," he declares, embracing economic policies his Republican predecessors would have rejected. The gentle tap of his fingers on economic reports reveals a pragmatist more than an ideologue. But beneath this productive exterior lurks a darkness that will eventually consume his presidency. Nixon's lifelong sense of being an outsider, his resentment of the Eastern establishment, and his conviction that enemies surround him create a toxic paranoia. You observe late-night meetings where he rants about perceived opponents, his voice growing hoarse with animosity. "We're going to get those sons of guns," he tells trusted aides, the soft clink of ice in his evening cocktail punctuating his determination. The enemy's list grows, the secret taping system records everything, and an atmosphere of suspicion permeates the West Wing. The 1972 election approaches, and despite Nixon's leading comfortably in the polls, his campaign approves increasingly extreme measures against political opponents. On June 17, 1972, 5 men are arrested breaking into Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. You watch Nixon receive the news with outward calm and inner panic. "Just be sure we play it cool," he instructs H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff. The soft closing of the Oval Office door, as his closest advisors gather, marks the beginning of the cover-up that will ultimately prove more damaging than the break-in itself. Over the next 2 years, the Watergate scandal slowly unravels the Nixon presidency. Despite his landslide re-election in 1972, the threads of the cover-up gradually unravel. Senate hearings captivate the nation. The Saturday Night Massacre. The revelation of the White House taping system. The battle over the tapes. You observe Nixon growing increasingly isolated, sleeping poorly, drinking more heavily. The soft rustle of transcripts being reviewed by his diminishing circle of loyal aides contrasts with the growing chorus of calls for his resignation. The Supreme Court unanimously orders Nixon to turn over the tapes. The smoking gun conversation of June 23, 1972, reveals his early involvement in the cover-up. Republican congressional leaders visit the White House to inform him he lacks the votes to survive impeachment. You watch as the realization dawns that his presidency is over, his face lined with exhaustion and defeat. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the White House residence counts down the final hours of his administration. On August 9, 1974, Nixon becomes the first president to resign from office. "Always remember," he tells his tearful staff, "others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself." The helicopter Marine One waits on the White House lawn to carry him away. You observe his famous final gesture arms raised in a victory salute that seems tragically disconnected from the moment's reality. The soft whir of helicopter blades whisks away a man whose remarkable talents were undone by equally remarkable flaws. In his post-presidency, Nixon works tirelessly to rehabilitate his reputation, writing books on foreign policy, offering counsel to later presidents, gradually recasting himself as an elder statesman. When he passes away in 1994, the nation remembers both his achievements and his disgrace. The soft closing of history books on the Nixon presidency inevitably includes the question of what might have been had his character matched his capabilities. As sleep draws ever nearer, consider that Nixon's presidency illustrates how internal demons can ultimately outweigh external accomplishments. The man who opened China and created the EPA also created the circumstances of his own downfall. The gentle lesson here might be that brilliance without emotional balance is a precarious foundation for leadership. Now, let your thoughts drift toward our next presidential portrait as we continue our soothing journey through the fascinating failures of America's highest office. It's April 15, 1865, and the nation is reeling from the unthinkable President Lincoln's assassination. In a small boarding house room not far from Ford's Theater, you witness a solemn, hastily arranged ceremony. Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase administers the oath of office to Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had been selected as Lincoln's running mate merely to balance the ticket. The room smells of leather-bound books and anxiety. No one had planned for this moment, least of all Johnson himself. "I, Andrew Johnson, do solemnly swear." The words hang heavy in the air. The new president's hands tremble slightly, perhaps from the weight of responsibility, perhaps from something else entirely. You see, Johnson had appeared visibly intoxicated at his vice-presidential inauguration, just 6 weeks earlier, delivering a rambling, incoherent speech that mortified Lincoln and embarrassed the nation. Not the most auspicious beginning for the man now tasked with healing a wounded country. You follow Johnson through the White House, which still bears the invisible imprint of Lincoln's presence. The floorboards creak softly beneath your feet as Johnson paces at night, a self-taught tailor from Tennessee with a boulder-sized chip on his shoulder. His wife, Eliza, arranges his papers with quiet efficiency, whispering encouraging words that rarely seem to penetrate his stubborn demeanor. The grandfather clock in the hallway counts away the seconds of what will become one of America's most contentious presidencies. Johnson inherits a nation shattered by 4 years of bloody civil war. The South lies in ruins. 4 million formerly enslaved people await the fulfillment of freedom's promise, and Congress is dominated by radical Republicans with a vision of Reconstruction far different from Johnson's own. It's a political powder keg waiting for a match, and Johnson seems all too eager to strike one. Are you still comfortable? Let's pull the blanket of history a bit tighter around us. Initially, Johnson talks tough about treason and punishment. Treason must be made infamous, and traitors must be impoverished, he declares in the early days of his presidency. The radical Republicans nod in approval, assuming they have an ally. But like a weather vane in changing winds, Johnson's position shifts dramatically. You watch his face soften when former Confederate leaders come calling, hat in hand, seeking presidential pardons. Johnson, harboring deep sympathy for the South and an even deeper racial animus, begins dispensing pardons like candy at a parade. By summer's end in 1865, you observe Johnson implementing his own Reconstruction plan while Congress is in recess. Southern states are rapidly readmitted to the Union with minimal conditions. Former Confederate leaders return to power. And most troublingly, new black codes emerge across the South, effectively reimposing servitude in all but name. The soft rustling of these restrictive legal documents echoes through state legislatures like dry leaves skittering across a forgotten battlefield. When Congress reconvenes in December, the collision is immediate and spectacular. Radical Republicans refuse to seat representatives from Johnson's hastily reconstructed southern states. You watch Johnson's face redden with anger as he learns of the affront. "Those damn radicals," he mutters to his secretary, the soft scratch of his pen becoming more forceful as he writes yet another veto message. The sound of political compromise being torn asunder is surprisingly similar to that of paper being crumpled and tossed into a fire. The clash intensifies as Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, granting citizenship to all persons born in the United States. Johnson vetoes it. Congress overrides his veto, the first major legislation to be enacted over a presidential veto in American history. You witness Johnson's face twist with indignation. "The Constitution," he insists, though few are still listening. The pattern repeats with the Reconstruction Acts, the Tenure of Office Act, and the Command of the Army Act, all vetoed, all overridden. By 1867, Johnson's presidency has devolved into a sequence of political battles invariably lost. You observe him one evening, alone in the presidential study, a glass of whiskey in hand, muttering grievances against his congressional opponents. Outside the window, gas lamps illuminate a Washington growing and changing despite its president's resistance. The soft clink of his glass against the desk punctuates his isolation. Are your eyelids growing heavy yet? We're approaching the most dramatic moment of Johnson's troubled tenure. In February 1868, Johnson decides to remove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a Lincoln appointee sympathetic to the radical Republicans. The problem? The Tenure of Office Act specifically forbids him from doing so without Senate approval. You watch as Johnson, convinced of his constitutional authority, orders Stanton's dismissal anyway. Stanton refuses to leave, barricading himself in his office. The soft thud of the lock engaging on the War Department door becomes the opening salvo in America's first presidential impeachment. The House of Representatives votes to impeach Johnson on February 24, 1,868 articles of impeachment, primarily centered on his violation of the Tenure of Office Act. You stand in the crowded Senate gallery during the trial, the largest political spectacle the nation has yet witnessed. Johnson does not attend, but his presence looms over the proceedings like a stubborn shadow. The gentle rustle of ladies' fans and gentlemen's programs creates a soft backdrop to the solemn constitutional drama. The trial lasts for weeks, with Representative Thaddeus Stevens delivering the closing argument from a chair too ill to stand. When the Senate votes on May 16, 1,868, the tension in the chamber is thick enough to cut with a knife. The final tally: 35 for conviction, 19 for acquittal. Johnson survives by a single vote, the narrowest of margins separating him from the historic disgrace of removal from office. You observe a small smile cross his face when he receives the news, not triumph, merely vindication. Johnson's remaining 10 months in office pass in political irrelevance. Denied his party's nomination for the 1,868 election, he returns to Tennessee after Grant's inauguration. His political career isn't quite finished in a remarkable twist. Tennessee will send him back to the Senate in 1,875, making him the only former president to later serve in the Senate. But his brief, tumultuous tenure as president stands as a testament to the dangers of accidental leadership and inflexible ideology. The soft closing of the White House door behind him seems to symbolize the nation's collective sigh of relief. As you drift closer to sleep, consider that Johnson's presidency, born in national tragedy, never escaped its inauspicious beginnings. His stubborn resistance to civil rights and inability to work with Congress delayed the healing of the nation's wounds. The soft whispers of what might have been haunt this chapter of American history. What if Lincoln had lived? What if a more temperate hand had guided Reconstruction? These questions, like gentle waves, can carry you towards slumber as we prepare to meet our next presidential misadventure. The scene shifts once more, and now the soft glow of television lights illuminates the White House in the mid-1970s. A sturdy, athletic man with a kindly face and slightly furrowed brow stands in the East Room, having just taken the oath of office under the most unusual circumstances in American history. This is Gerald Ford, America's 38th president, the only man to serve as both vice president and president without being elected to either office. Are you comfortable? Let this tale of well-intentioned clumsiness gently rock you toward dreamland. It's August 9, 1974, and Ford's swearing-in ceremony carries none of the pageantry typically associated with presidential inaugurations. The atmosphere is solemn, almost funereal, as Nixon's helicopter has just departed the White House lawn. You notice how Ford's honest face seems both determined and slightly overwhelmed as he addresses a nation exhausted by Watergate. "Our long national nightmare is over," he declares, his voice steady and reassuring. The gentle rustle of his prepared remarks seems to symbolize a turning of the page in American history. "I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear." The words are delivered with the straightforward manner of a former college football player and longtime congressman from Michigan. Ford brings to the presidency a reputation for decency and integrity, a stark contrast to his predecessor. The son of a paint salesman who rose through hard work and affability rather than brilliance or cunning, he has reached the pinnacle of American politics through an extraordinary sequence of accidents. The soft creak of the White House floorboards beneath his feet reminds us that he never expected to walk these halls as president. You follow Ford into the executive mansion, watching as he settles into the rhythm of a job he never sought. He rises early for swimming sessions, the gentle splash of his morning laps a counterpoint to the weighty decisions awaiting him. His wife Betty, forthright and independent-minded, brings a refreshing candor to the role of First Lady. The soft clink of ice in evening cocktail glasses signals the end of another day's work for a couple who seem remarkably normal compared to the imperial presidency of the Nixon years. Are your eyelids growing heavy yet? Let's watch as Ford's well-meaning presidency encounters its first major obstacle. Just 1 month into his term, on September 8, 1974, Ford makes a decision that will define his brief presidency. He announces a full, free, and absolute pardon for Richard Nixon for any crimes he may have committed while in office. You observe Ford's face on television, earnest and determined as he explains his reasoning. Our national nightmare is over, but it will not end until we end it. The gentle whir of cameras recording his announcement cannot drown out the immediate public outcry. Ford's press secretary resigns in protest. The president's approval rating plummets 30 points virtually overnight. The soft shuffling of disillusioned feet walking away from Ford seems to presage the brevity of his tenure. As the months pass, Ford faces mounting challenges both domestic and international. The economy struggles with the dual problems of inflation and recession dubbed stagflation that seem immune to traditional economic remedies. You watch Ford pin win buttons, whip inflation now, to lapels in the Roosevelt Room, a simplistic solution to a complex problem that becomes an object of mockery. The soft rustle of economic reports being placed on his desk each morning brings increasingly troubling news of an economy that refuses to respond to his well-intentioned but ineffective policies. In foreign affairs, Ford faces the humiliating fall of Saigon in April 1975, effectively ending America's long involvement in Vietnam. Television screens display desperate South Vietnamese allies clinging to departing American helicopters. You observe Ford in the Situation Room, his face drawn with concern as he authorizes Operation Frequent Wind to evacuate remaining Americans and some South Vietnamese. The soft hum of emergency communications equipment provides a backdrop to the inglorious end of America's longest war to that point. "It's a sad day," Ford murmurs to Henry Kissinger, who has remained as Secretary of State. Ford's presidency becomes notable for its physical mishaps as much as its policies. In a scene immortalized by comedians, he tumbles down the stairs of Air Force One while visiting Austria. You wince as his feet tangle and he sprawls forward, only to recover with a forced smile and wave. The soft thud of presidential dignity taking a tumble is followed by the quiet snickers of aides trying to maintain composure. Chevy Chase on Saturday Night Live turns Ford's clumsiness into a national punchline, cementing the image of a well-meaning but awkward president. Ford, to his credit, takes the mockery with good humor, even appearing on the show to deliver the famous line, "Live from New York, it's Saturday night." The 1976 election approaches, and Ford faces a serious primary challenge from former California Governor Ronald Reagan. He survives the nomination battle by a whisker, then confronts Democratic nominee Jimmy Carter in the general election. You watch Ford's performance in their televised debates, including his infamous gaffe declaring that there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. The soft gasp from journalists in the room underscores the magnitude of this misstatement. Despite a late surge in the polls, Ford loses the election by a narrow margin 51% to 48% in the popular vote. On January 20, 1977, Ford's brief 895-day presidency comes to an end. You observe him graciously attending Carter's inauguration, the gentle January breeze ruffling his hair as he prepares to return to private life. "I have not achieved what I had hoped to achieve," he admits in his final days in office. The soft click of his personal items being packed away in boxes seems to underscore the transient nature of his unexpected presidency. In his post-presidential years, Ford enjoys a gradual rehabilitation of his reputation. As the passions of Watergate recede, many come to see the Nixon pardon as a necessary act of national healing rather than a corrupt bargain. He serves on corporate boards, plays golf, and enjoys the longest post-presidency in history until surpassed by Jimmy Carter. When he passes away in 2006 at age 93, the nation mourns a decent man who stepped into an impossible situation and did his honest best. The soft lowering of flags to half-staff honors a president remembered more for his character than his achievements. As sleep beckons closer, consider that Ford's presidency illustrates how good intentions and personal decency may not be sufficient for presidential success. The accidental president who fell downstairs also presided over America's fall from global dominance in the post-Vietnam era. The gentle lesson here might be that sometimes history places individuals in roles for which they are neither prepared nor particularly suited. Now, let your thoughts drift toward our next presidential portrait, as we continue our soothing journey through the fascinating inadequacies of America's highest office. The scene changes once more, and now the softer, energy-conserving lights of the late 1970s illuminate the White House. A slender man with a toothy smile and earnest eyes sits at the presidential desk, poring over policy briefs with the meticulous attention of an engineer. This is Jimmy Carter, America's 39th president, a man whose moral clarity and intelligence would prove insufficient against a tide of national malaise and international crises. Are you settling deeper into your pillow? Let this tale of virtuous ineffectiveness guide you closer to slumber. It's January 20, 1977, and Carter's inauguration sets an immediate tone of folksy authenticity. After taking the oath, he and First Lady Rosalynn Carter step out of their limousine to walk the inaugural parade route to the White House. You notice how the crowd responds warmly to this gesture of democratic simplicity from the peanut farmer turned president. The air feels hopeful as this Washington outsider promises a government as good and honest and decent and truthful and fair and competent as the American people. The gentle scuff of his shoes on Pennsylvania Avenue symbolizes his determination to remain connected to ordinary citizens. I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear. The oath is delivered with the precise diction of a Naval Academy graduate. Carter brings to the presidency an impressive intellect and unquestioned moral character, but limited political experience beyond his term as Georgia governor. The son of a peanut farmer who rose through hard work, faith, and engineering acumen, he has reached the White House as an antidote to the corruption and cynicism of the Nixon-Ford years. The soft rustle of his modest suit as he raises his right hand seems to signify the unassuming style that will characterize his presidency for better and worse. You follow Carter into the executive mansion, observing his determination to demystify the presidency. He carries his own garment bag down the steps of Air Force One. He installs solar panels on the White House roof. He wears cardigan sweaters for fireside chats about energy conservation. The gentle click of the thermostat being turned down in the White House corridors symbolizes his practical approach to leadership during an energy crisis. His wife Rosalynn serves as a trusted advisor rather than a ceremonial first lady. The soft scratch of her pen taking notes in cabinet meetings signals their partnership in governance. Carter's administration begins with modest successes. You observe him hunched over detailed briefing papers, mastering complex policy issues that his predecessors might have delegated. His creation of the Department of Energy and Department of Education expands the federal government's focus on critical national priorities. The soft shuffling of organizational charts being revised reflects his engineer's belief that proper structure leads to proper function. His emphasis on human rights in foreign policy represents a moral stance welcomed by many after years of cold Kissingerian realpolitik. Are your eyelids growing heavy? There's something soothingly familiar about watching noble intentions encounter harsh realities. By 1978, Carter faces mounting economic challenges that will define his presidency. Inflation soars to double digits. Energy prices spike following the Iranian Revolution. Interest rates climb precipitously. You watch him in the Oval Office, shirt sleeves rolled up, studying economic forecasts with the concentration of a man trying to solve an engineering problem with moral philosophy. The soft tap of his pencil on troubling economic indicators betrays his growing frustration. His appointment of Paul Volcker as Federal Reserve Chairman will eventually tame inflation, but too late to benefit Carter politically. July 15, 1979, marks a pivotal moment in Carter's presidency. He addresses the nation in what becomes known as the Malaise speech, though he never uses that word. You observe him on television, somberly diagnosing a crisis of confidence in American life. Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption, he warns. The gentle whir of televisions being turned off across America signals public rejection of his message. Though substantively accurate, his assessment comes across as blaming citizens for presidential failures. Days later, he asks for the resignation of his entire cabinet, creating an impression of administration in disarray. Carter's foreign policy initially shows promise with the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. You watch him shuttle tirelessly between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, his diplomatic persistence bringing peace between longtime enemies. The soft scratch of pens signing the historic agreement stands as perhaps his greatest achievement. But this triumph is soon overshadowed by the Iranian hostage crisis, beginning in November 1979, when 52 Americans are seized at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held for 444 days. As the hostage crisis drags on throughout 1980, Carter's presidency effectively collapses under its weight. A failed rescue attempt ends in disaster at Desert One, with 8 American servicemen dead. You observe Carter receiving the news of the failure, his face drawn with exhaustion and defeat. The soft tick of the Oval Office clock counts down the days of the crisis, which becomes a nightly feature on American television. America held hostage, day 325, becomes more than a news taglinate, becomes a metaphor for Carter's ineffective leadership. The 1980 election approaches, and Carter faces challenges on multiple fronts. Senator Ted Kennedy launches a primary challenge from the left. Ronald Reagan emerges as the Republican nominee, offering optimistic rhetoric in stark contrast to Carter's perceived pessimism. You watch the presidential debate where Carter's detailed policy knowledge seems pedantic compared to Reagan's folksy charm and devastating question. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? The soft murmur of voters deciding against a second Carter term grows into an electoral landslide for Reagan. On January 20, 1981, Carter's presidency ends with a final, cruel irony. Hostages are released just minutes after Reagan takes the oath of office, having been held until the final moments of Carter's term. You observe Carter flying to Germany to greet the freed hostages as a private citizen, dignity intact despite political humiliation. The soft hum of the plane engines carries away a man whose presidency is widely deemed a failure, despite his evident intelligence and good intentions. In his post-presidency, Carter achieves what many consider greatness denied him in office. His work with Habitat for Humanity, election monitoring, and disease eradication earns him the Nobel Peace Prize and universal respect. When he passes away in 2023 at the remarkable age of 98, having lived the longest post-presidency in history, the nation mourns a man whose greatest contributions to humanity came after leaving the office he had worked so hard to attain. The soft closing of his simple coffin in Plains, Georgia, marks the end of a life that redefined what former presidents could accomplish. As sleep draws ever nearer, consider that Carter's presidency illustrates how moral certainty and intelligence may not translate to effective leadership. The nuclear engineer who understood policy details failed to inspire a nation seeking renewed confidence. The gentle lesson here might be that empathy for citizen concerns sometimes matters more than technical solutions to their problems. Now, let your thoughts drift toward our next presidential portrait, as we continue our soothing journey through the well-intentioned failures of America's highest office. The soft patter of rain falls on the muddy streets of Washington, D.C., as we turn our attention to a new presidential portrait. A tall, distinguished-looking military man stands hatless in the biting March wind, silver hair dampened by persistent drizzle, as he delivers the longest inaugural address in American history. This is William Henry Harrison, America's 9th president, a man whose term would prove as brief as his inaugural address was lengthy. Are your eyelids growing heavy? Let this tale of hubris and pneumonia lull you toward pleasant dreams. It's March 4, 1841, and Harrison's inauguration unfolds beneath leaden skies. Despite the cold, wet weather, the 68-year-old president-elect has eschewed both hat and overcoat, determined to demonstrate his vigor and hardiness to the assembled crowd. You notice how his military bearing remains impressive, a testament to the hero of Tippecanoe, who defeated Tecumseh's Confederation decades earlier. The crowd shivers as he launches into a speech that will last nearly 2 hours, 445 words of classical allusions and political philosophy. The gentle splash of raindrops on his uncovered head seems to foreshadow the brevity of his coming administration. I, William Henry Harrison, do solemnly swear. The oath is delivered with the confidence of a man who has finally achieved his life's ambition after decades of military and political service. Harrison brings to the presidency a distinguished military record, but limited political vision, having campaigned on little more than his war record and opposition to the incumbent party. The son of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, he has reached the White House through a campaign of populist symbols, log cabins and hard cider, despite his own aristocratic Virginia roots. The soft squelch of his boots in the inaugural mud seems to mark the distance between his manufactured image and political reality. You follow Harrison into the executive mansion, watching as he energetically takes up the business of the highest office. He rises early, determined to respond personally to the flood of office seekers overwhelming the White House. The gentle scratch of his pen-signing appointments fills his days as he attempts to satisfy the patronage demands of his Whig Party supporters. His wife Anna remains behind in Ohio, planning to join him later in the spring when Washington's weather improves. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the empty family quarters seems to count down the days of an administration destined to end before it properly begins. By late March, Harrison's health begins to falter. You observe him in his bedroom, wrapped in blankets, yet shivering with fever. A persistent cold has settled in his chest, developing into pneumonia in an era before antibiotics. The soft wheeze of his labored breathing grows more concerning by the day. Doctors apply the standard treatments of the time-blistering, bleeding, and various potions which likely weaken him further. The office of president requires the constitution of a horse, he mutters weakly to his physician. The gentle rattle of medicine bottles on his bedside table punctuates the increasingly worried whispers of his attendants. On April 4, 1841, exactly 1 month after his inauguration, Harrison's brief presidency reaches its conclusion. You witness the solemn gathering around his bed as he slips away, becoming the first president to die in office. His final delirious words seem directed at a non-existent successor. Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more. The soft closing of his eyes marks the end of the shortest presidential term in American history, just 30 days, 12 hours, and 30 minutes. Are you feeling drowsy yet? Let the gentle rhythm of historical irony ease you towards sleep. Harrison's death creates an immediate constitutional crisis. You observe the cabinet in emergency session, debating whether Vice President John Tyler should be considered the actual president or merely an acting president. The soft rustling of the Constitution's pages fails to provide clear guidance, as the document stipulates only that presidential powers devolve upon the vice president. Tyler resolves the matter decisively, declaring himself the full president and establishing a precedent that will guide all future presidential successions. The gentle closing of the cabinet room door marks the end of America's first presidential succession crisis. In the days following Harrison's death, A nation that barely got to know its new leader mourns his passing. You watch the funeral procession wind through Washington streets, the somber drumbeats marking time as the horse-drawn hearse carries Harrison's body. The White House staff, who had barely learned his habits and preferences, now prepare for a new occupant. The soft swish of brooms sweeping away the brief physical evidence of Harrison's presence seems to underscore the fleeting nature of his administration. His policies and plans, whatever they might have been, depart with him, leaving behind only the cautionary tale of an elderly man who refused to wear a coat in the rain. Harrison's legacy endures primarily as a historical curiosity, the president who served the shortest term. You notice how quickly his name fades from public discourse, his brief administration leaving no legislation, no executive orders, no meaningful impact on the nation he so briefly led. The soft flutter of history books closing on his brief chapter symbolizes how quickly even the highest office can be reduced to a footnote. His campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, becomes more famous than anything he did as president, a jingle outlasting his administration by generations. As sleep draws ever closer, consider that Harrison's presidency illustrates the role of chance and circumstance in shaping history. The man who won the White House through an innovative but substance-free campaign never had the opportunity to demonstrate whether he could govern effectively. The gentle lesson might be that sometimes history turns not on grand decisions or bold policies, but on whether one remembers to wear an overcoat. Now, let your thoughts drift toward our next presidential portrait, as we continue our soothing journey through the fascinating inadequacies of America's highest office. The scene shifts once more, and now the gaslights flicker in the post-Civil War White House of the 1870s. A compact, bearded man in a rumpled suit sits at his desk, military bearing still evident despite civilian clothes. His eyes, which once commanded armies with clear strategic vision, now appear bewildered by the political machinations surrounding him. This is Ulysses S. Grant, America's 18th president, the brilliant general whose military genius failed to translate into political acumen. Are you comfortable? Let this tale of good intentions undermined by misplaced trust guide you toward peaceful slumber. It's March 4, 1869, and Grant's inauguration marks the arrival of the nation's youngest president to date, at just 46 years old. The hero of Appomattox takes the oath with the same quiet determination that characterized his military campaigns. You notice how the crowd cheers wildly for the general who saved the Union, his popularity unmatched since Washington. "Let us have peace," he had simply stated in accepting the Republican nomination, and the nation still recovering from civil war and the tumultuous Johnson presidency embraces this promise of tranquility. The gentle waving of American flags seems to herald a new era of national reconciliation under trusted leadership. I, Ulysses S. Grant, do solemnly swear. The oath is delivered with the straightforward manner that characterized his military commands. Grant brings to the presidency unquestioned patriotism and integrity, but limited political experience and an unfortunate tendency to trust the wrong people. The son of a tanner who rose through military brilliance rather than political cunning, he has reached the White House as a symbol of Union victory and national healing. The soft creak of the platform beneath his feet seems to foreshadow the unsteady ground upon which his presidency will rest. You follow Grant into the executive mansion, observing his discomfort with the pomp of presidential life. He approaches governing with the same direct logic he applied to military campaigns, but soon discovers politics follows different rules than warfare. The gentle scratch of his pen signing appointments fills his early days, as he fills his administration with old army colleagues and friends, a fateful decision that will plague his presidency. His wife, Julia, devoted and somewhat status-conscious, embraces the social aspects of First Lady duties that Grant himself finds tedious. The soft clink of fine china at elaborate state dinners contrasts with Grant's own simple tastes and unassuming manner. Grant's administration begins with genuine accomplishments in civil rights. You observe him at his desk, resolutely signing the 15th Amendment guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The soft rustling of this historic document signals his sincere commitment to protecting the rights of formerly enslaved Americans. His administration prosecutes the Ku Klux Klan and deploys federal troops to protect black voters in the South. The gentle tap of his finger on reports of Southern violence reveals his determination to enforce Reconstruction policies more effectively than his predecessor. Are your eyelids growing heavy? Let the rhythmic flow of historical narrative carry you closer to dreams. By 1872, scandal begins to engulf Grant's administration. The whispers start with the gold conspiracy, as speculators, including Grant's brother-in-law, attempt to corner the gold market. You watch Grant in the Oval Office, confusion evident on his face as he learns of corruption among those he trusted implicitly. The soft thud of newspapers landing on his desk each morning brings fresh revelations of wrongdoing. The Credit Mobilier scandal implicates his vice president and several congressmen in a railroad stock scheme. The whiskey ring defrauds the Treasury of millions in tax revenue, with Grant's own private secretary deeply involved. The gentle sigh escaping Grant's lips reflects his growing realization that his military instinct for judging character has failed him in the political realm. Despite the scandals, Grant wins re-election in 1872, defeating newspaper editor Horace Greeley. His second term brings mounting challenges, both political and economic. You observe Grant in the Treasury Department, brow furrowed as he grapples with the panic of 1873, a severe economic depression triggered by railroad overexpansion and bank failures. The soft murmur of financial experts offering conflicting advice seems to highlight his limited understanding of economic matters. His response vetoing an inflation bill, while later supporting paper currency, reveals his economic uncertainty. Meanwhile, his Reconstruction policies face growing Northern indifference and Southern resistance. The gentle flutter of reports from the South documents the gradual erosion of civil rights gains as federal resolve weakens. By 1876, Grant's presidency is widely considered a disappointment. You watch him in the final months of his administration, exhausted and disillusioned, yet maintaining the stoic dignity that characterized his military career. The soft shuffling of his feet as he walks the White House corridors suggests the weight of unfulfilled promise. Though personally honest, his administration has become synonymous with the corruption of the Gilded Age he presided over. The gentle closing of the White House door behind him in March 1877 marks the end of an administration remembered more for scandal than achievement. Grant's post-presidency brings both tragedy and redemption. Financial disaster strikes when his investment in his son's financial firm collapses. You observe him, now aged beyond his years, working determinedly at his desk, racing to complete his memoirs before throat cancer claims his life. The soft scratch of his pen on paper during these final painful months produces what will be hailed as one of the finest military memoirs ever written. Mark Twain publishes the work, which restores Grant's finances and reputation. When he passes in 1885, the nation mourns the general it had loved more than the president it had grown to criticize. As sleep beckons ever closer, consider that Grant's presidency illustrates the stark difference between military and political leadership. The decisive general who accepted nothing less than unconditional surrender proved unable to recognize or root out corruption among those he trusted. The gentle lesson might be that different contexts require different skills, and that personal integrity, while necessary for leadership, is not always sufficient. Now, let your thoughts drift toward our next presidential portrait, as we continue our soothing journey through the fascinating inadequacies of America's highest office. The scene changes once again, transporting us back to the raucous 1830s as gaslight flickers across the White House walls. A tall, gaunt figure with wild white hair paces the floors, leaning occasionally on his cannon from age, but from the bullets still lodged in his body from numerous duels. This is Andrew Jackson, America's 7th president, the frontier warrior whose democratic vision was matched only by his autocratic temperament. Are you settling deeper into your pillow? Let this tale of passionate democracy and troubling contradictions guide you toward peaceful dreams. It's March 4, 1829, and Jackson's inauguration has unleashed chaos in the capital. After taking the oath, he rides on horseback to the White House, followed by thousands of his supporters, ordinary citizens in muddy boots, who have never before been invited to an inaugural celebration. You observe with a mixture of amusement and alarm as they pour into the executive mansion, standing on damask chairs in their dirty boots, breaking china in their enthusiasm to shake the hand of their hero. The people's house should be open to the people, Jackson insists, even as his staff lures the crowd onto the lawn with tubs of whiskey, laced punch to prevent further damage. The gentle sway of brocade curtains in the breeze from broken windows seems to herald a new, more democratic and disorderly era in American politics. I, Andrew Jackson, do solemnly swear. The oath is delivered with the fierce determination of a man who believes the previous election was stolen from him. Jackson brings to the presidency an unwavering sense of personal honor and populist instincts, but also a volcanic temper and tendency toward absolutism. The son of Scots, Irish immigrants who rose through military heroism and frontier toughness, he has reached the White House as the champion of the common man against what he sees as corrupt elites. The soft thud of his walking stick on the White House floor seems to emphasize the forceful personality that will dominate American politics for the next 8 years. You follow Jackson through the corridors of power, watching as he dismantles the existing political order. He introduces the spoils system, replacing government officials with his own supporters. To the victor belong the spoils, his allies proclaim, as the gentle rustle of termination notices and new appointments flows through government offices. His wife Rachel having passed away between his election and inauguration, Jackson's White House social life is managed by his daughter-in-law Emily, while he relies on an informal kitchen cabinet of advisors who meet over late-night pipes and whiskey. The soft clink of glasses and murmur of strategic conversations echoes through the presidential residence long after formal cabinet meetings have concluded. Jackson's defining battle emerges in his war against the Second Bank of the United States. You observe him at his desk, penning his veto of the bank's recharter with righteous indignation against what he calls the monster institution that favors the wealthy. "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it," he declares, the soft scratch of his quill underlining his determination. His opponents, led by Senator Henry Clay and Bank President Nicholas Biddle, warn of economic disaster. When Jackson withdraws federal deposits from the bank, placing them in state pet banks, his enemies have him censured by the Senate. The gentle tap of the gavel announcing this rebuke does nothing to deter Jackson's crusade. Are your eyelids growing heavier? Let the rhythm of political conflict from long ago lull you closer to slumber. By 1835, Jackson has transformed the presidency into a more powerful office than his predecessors ever envisioned. You watch as he faces down South Carolina's attempt at nullification, the state's claim that it can invalidate federal tariff laws it considers unconstitutional. "Our federal union, it must be preserved," Jackson toasts at a dinner, fixing his steely gaze on his Vice President John C. Calhoun, a South Carolinian who supports nullification. The soft tinkle of silverware falling silent captures the dramatic tension of the moment. Jackson threatens to send federal troops and hang the nullifiers as traitors. A compromise tariff ultimately resolves the crisis, but Jackson's willingness to use force establishes a precedent for federal authority that will echo decades later during the Civil War. Perhaps the darkest chapter of Jackson's presidency unfolds with the forced relocation of Native American tribes. You observe him signing the Indian Removal Act of 1830, authorizing the government to exchange Native American land in the East for territory west of the Mississippi. The gentle flutter of the document's pages belies the human suffering it will cause. When the Supreme Court rules in Worcester v. Georgia that native tribes are sovereign nations that cannot be removed without their consent, Jackson allegedly scoffs. John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. The soft padding of thousands of moccasined feet along what will be called the Trail of Tears represents the human cost of Jackson's Indian removal policy. Thousands perish during the forced marches westward. As Jackson's second term concludes in 1837, his economic policies contribute to financial crisis. You witness the panic of 1837 unfold just as he leaves office, triggered partly by his war on the bank and his specie circular requiring payment for government land in gold or silver. The soft rustle of worthless paper money, changing hands in increasingly desperate transactions, signals the beginning of a 5-year depression that will plague his successor, Martin Van Buren. Jackson retires to his plantation, the Hermitage, having transformed the presidency into a more powerful office for better and worse than the founders had intended. In his post-presidential years, Jackson continues to influence his Democratic Party from his Tennessee home. You visit him in his final days in 1845, his once robust frame now gaunt and racked with pain from old wounds and illness. When asked if he has any regrets, he reportedly answers that I was unable to shoot Henry Clay or hang John C. Calhoun. The soft chuckle that follows suggests either humor or genuine sentiment with Jackson. It's often difficult to tell. As the nation mourns his passing, they remember a president who embodied the contradictions of American democracy, champion of the common man and defender of slavery, advocate for popular sovereignty and executor of forced removal, democratic visionary and executive autocrat. As sleep draws ever nearer, consider that Jackson's presidency illustrates the double-edged sword of populist leadership. The man who expanded democratic participation also expanded executive power in ways that sometimes trampled minority rights. The gentle lesson might be that democracy requires not just popular will but also constitutional restraint. Now, let your thoughts drift toward our next presidential portrait, as we continue our soothing journey through the fascinating inadequacies of America's highest office. The scene shifts once more, and now electric lights illuminate the White House of the jazz-infused 1920s. A slight, stern-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses sits in a comfortable chair, a book open in his lap, seemingly oblivious to the revelry of the era unfolding beyond the presidential walls. This is Calvin Coolidge, America's 30th president, a man whose legendary reticence and minimal approach to governance earned him the nickname Silent Cal. Are you comfortable? Let this tale of presidential inaction amid national transformation ease you toward dreamland. It's August 3, 1923, and Coolidge becomes president in unusually humble circumstances following Warren Harding's sudden death. Visiting his family homestead in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, he receives word of Harding's passing in the middle of the night. You observe as his father, a notary public, administers the oath of office by kerosene lamplight in the family's modest parlor. I, Calvin Coolidge, do solemnly swear. The new president then goes back to bidet fitting, beginning for an administration that will elevate inaction to a governing philosophy. The gentle tick of the family's simple mantel clock seems to symbolize Coolidge's belief in steady, unchanging government. Coolidge brings to the presidency a Vermont frugality and taciturnity that stands in stark contrast to the exuberance of the Roaring Twenties. The son of a village storekeeper who rose through steady, unspectacular service in Massachusetts politics, he has reached the White House as the antidote to Harding's scandals and sociability. 4/5 of all our troubles would disappear if we would only sit down and keep still, he once observed, and the soft creak of his rocking chair on the White House porch becomes a metaphor for his passive governing style. His wife Grace manages the social obligations he finds tedious, while he retreats whenever possible to solitary reading or his famous afternoon naps. You follow Coolidge through his daily routine, marveling at his capacity for sleep. He regularly retires by 10 p.m., sleeps until 7 or 8 a.m., naps every afternoon from 2 to 4, and often returns to bed by 9 p.m., sleeping 11 to 12 hours daily, while the nation cavorts through its most exuberant decade. The gentle rustle of bedsheets being turned down in mid-afternoon seems almost subversive during an era of speakeasies and marathon dance contests. "The chief business of the American people is business," Coolidge famously declares, and he sees his primary presidential duty as staying out of its way. The soft shuffling of papers on his desk, fewer than any modern president, reflects his minimal approach to governance. Coolidge's presidency coincides with an economic boom he does little to regulate. You observe him receiving reports of soaring stock prices and consumer spending with quiet satisfaction. "The man who builds a factory builds a temple," he intones, the soft tap of his finger on the economic reports emphasizing his laissez-faire philosophy. His Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, pushes through major tax cuts that primarily benefit the wealthy, while his Commerce Secretary, Herbert Hoover, ironically, advocates for a more active government role. The gentle closing of Coolidge's office door on such debates signals his preference for business unfettered by government oversight. Are your thoughts drifting pleasantly? Let the soothing story of presidential passivity guide you closer to sleep. When scandals from the Harding administration continue to unfold, Coolidge remains characteristically detached. You watch him receive news of the Teapot Dome investigations with minimal reaction, allowing the judicial process to proceed without presidential comment. The soft rustle of newspaper pages being turned each morning brings fresh revelations about Harding's corrupt Ohio gang, but Coolidge simply distances himself from the previous administration without taking affirmative steps to reform government. When asked about prohibition enforcement, perhaps the most flagrantly ignored law in American history, he offers little beyond platitudes about respecting the Constitution. The gentle clink of illegally produced cocktail glasses throughout the nation seems to mock his nominal support for the increasingly unpopular law. Coolidge's most famous characteristic, his remarkable silence, becomes legendary during his presidency. At a dinner party, a young woman tells him she has bet she could get more than 2 words out of him. "You lose," he replies simply. The soft chuckle that follows this anecdote wherever it's told captures the public's amused affection for their reticent leader. Despite his silence, or perhaps because of it, Coolidge becomes surprisingly popular. When he runs for a full term in 1924, he wins easily against a divided opposition. The gentle scratch of pencils marking ballots for Coolidge suggests that, in the prosperous, isolationist 1920s, many Americans are content with a president who promises little and speaks less. In 1927, Coolidge surprises the nation with a terse statement: "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. You observe the political establishment's shock at this voluntary relinquishment of power from a president who could easily win re-election. The soft flutter of speculation about his motives fills newspaper columns and private conversations. Is it grief over his son's death in 1924? Political foresight about economic troubles ahead? Simple weariness with public life? Coolidge himself offers no explanation, maintaining his characteristic silence. The gentle closing of the White House door behind him in March 1929 marks the end of an administration defined more by what it didn't do than by what it did. Coolidge retires to Northampton, Massachusetts, writing his autobiography and occasional newspaper columns. You visit him in his modest home, where he seems content with private life, showing more animation when discussing fishing than when recalling his presidency. When the stock market crashes just months after he leaves office, triggering the Great Depression, some begin to question whether his hands-off approach to financial regulation contributed to the economic disaster. The soft rustle of stock certificates becoming worthless in October, 1929, casts a retrospective shadow over his presidency's laissez-faire economics. When he passes away in 1933, as the nation struggles through its greatest economic crisis, the contrast between Coolidge's passive approach and the activist government of his successor's New Deal becomes a study in presidential opposites. As sleep draws ever closer, consider that Coolidge's presidency illustrates the limitations of minimal government during times that may require more active leadership. The man who believed that the chief business of the American people is business presided over an economic bubble whose inevitable burst he neither predicted nor prepared for. The gentle lesson might be that presidential responsibility sometimes requires more than benign neglect, no matter how peaceful the slumber it provides. Now, let your thoughts drift toward our next presidential portrait, as we continue our soothing journey through the fascinating inadequacies of America's highest office. The scene shifts once more, taking us back to the earliest days of the Republic, as candlelight flickers across the freshly painted walls of the still unfinished White House. A short, plump man with an oversized head paces the floors, dictating passionate, lengthy letters to a secretary struggling to keep up with his racing thoughts. This is John Adams, America's second president, the brilliant founding father whose prickly temperament and political missteps made him our first one-term president. Are your eyelids growing heavy? Let this tale of intellectual brilliance, undermined by personal cantankerousness, guide you toward peaceful slumber. It's March 4, 1797, and Adams's inauguration represents the first peaceful transfer of power in the young republic. You observe as he takes the oath in Philadelphia, the nation's temporary capital, standing in the considerable shadow of his predecessor, George Washington. I, John Adams, do solemnly swear. The words are delivered with the precise diction of a Harvard-educated lawyer and revolutionary philosopher. Washington's dignified presence at the ceremony only highlights the contrast between the beloved, towering general and his shorter, testier successor. The gentle rustling of Adams's inaugural address suggests the scholarly approach he brings to an office still being defined by its occupants. Adams brings to the presidency unmatched experience and intellectual firepower, but also a thin-skinned vanity and stubborn self-righteousness that will plague his single term. The son of a Massachusetts farmer who rose through education and legal brilliance, he has reached the White House after decades of service to the Revolution and the new nation. The soft scratch of his quill on paper captures his preference for written arguments over the personal charm his office increasingly demands. His wife Abigail, equally brilliant and strong-willed, serves as his closest advisor, famously reminding him to remember the ladies in his political considerations. The gentle creak of floorboards beneath her determined step through the presidential residence signals the strength of her influence. You follow Adams into the newly constructed President's House in Washington, D.C., which he occupies in its half-finished state in November 1800. I pray heaven to bestow the best blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it, he writes to Abigail. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. The soft echo of his words hanging in the cavernous, unfinished rooms creates an almost ghostly effect. He will spend only 4 cold, lonely months in this massive residence before leaving office, with Abigail joining him for just a few weeks. The gentle tap of his walking stick on the wooden floors during his solitary evening strolls emphasizes the isolation of the presidency he is about to lose. Adams's presidency is quickly consumed by an undeclared naval quasi-war with France. You observe him in his study, receiving reports of French seizures of American merchant ships with mounting frustration. The soft fluttering of naval dispatches being placed on his desk brings increasingly alarming news of international tensions. When he sends commissioners to France to negotiate peace, they are met with demands for bribes in what becomes known as the XYZ affair. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, becomes the public cry. and Adams finds himself leading a nation clamoring for war with its former ally. The gentle swaying of yellow ribbons on ladies' dress, a symbol of support for Adams's policies, marks a rare moment of public approval for the embattled president. Are you feeling drowsy yet? Let the soothing rhythm of diplomatic history ease your mind toward dreams. By 1798, Adams makes the most consequential mistake of his presidency. You watch as he signs the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts, restricting immigration and limiting free speech critical of the government. The soft press of his presidential seal into the wax on these documents marks a betrayal of the very liberties he had helped establish. While he views the laws as necessary during a time of potential war, they are used primarily to silence his political opponents, particularly Republican newspaper editors who face arrest for criticizing his administration. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison respond with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, arguing states can nullify unconstitutional federal laws. The gentle rustle of these resolutions being circulated among state legislators plants seeds of states' rights arguments that will reverberate through American history. Adams's presidency is further undermined by fierce divisions within his own Federalist Party. You observe his growing isolation as Alexander Hamilton, still wielding enormous influence though holding no office, works behind the scenes to control cabinet appointments and military preparations. That bastard brat of a Scottish peddler! Adams fumes privately about Hamilton, his brilliant invective wasted in the confines of his personal correspondence. The soft closing of cabinet room doors for meetings where Adams's own appointees work against him symbolizes his failure to command loyalty. When he makes the courageous but politically damaging decision to pursue peace with France against his party's wishes, he effectively ensures his electoral defeat. As the election of 1800 approaches, Adams faces a rematch with his former friend and now political rival, Thomas Jefferson. You witness the first truly partisan presidential campaign, with the Federalists painting Jefferson as a dangerous radical and the Republicans portraying Adams as a monarchist. The soft thud of partisan pamphlets being distributed throughout the young nation signals the end of any hope for non-partisan governance. When the results come in, Adams finishes third behind Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who were intended as a president, vice president ticket but received equal electoral votes, creating a constitutional crisis. The gentle sigh escaping Adams's lips as he reads the election returns reflects his deep disappointment at being rejected by the country he helped create. In the final hours of his presidency, Adams makes controversial midnight appointments, filling judicial positions with Federalists to maintain his party's influence in the courts. You observe him signing commissions by lamplight on his final evening in office, the soft scratch of his pen continuing into the night. He then departs the Capitol before dawn on Inauguration Day, refusing to attend Jefferson's swearing-in a petulant end to a difficult presidency. The gentle rumble of carriage wheels carrying him away from Washington in the pre-dawn hours marks an ignominious departure for a man who deserved better from history. Adams's post-presidency brings a measure of redemption through reflection and reconciliation. After years of bitter silence, he and Jefferson renew their friendship through remarkable correspondence in their final years. In a final historical flourish, both men pass away on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence they helped create. Adams's last words reportedly were, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing his great friend and rival had died just hours earlier. The soft closing of the book on their intertwined lives creates one of history's most poignant coincidences. As sleep draws ever nearer, consider that Adams's presidency illustrates how intellectual brilliance alone cannot ensure political success. The man whom Jefferson called the Colossus of Independence found the political arena less suited to his talents than the Revolutionary Committee room. The gentle lesson might be that leadership requires not just intelligence, but temperament, not just conviction, but compromise. Now, let your thoughts drift toward our final presidential portrait as we conclude our soothing journey through the fascinating inadequacies of America's highest office. As our journey through presidential inadequacy draws to a close, your eyelids must surely be growing heavy. Let us gently reflect on what these stories of high office foibles can teach us as we drift towards slumber. The soft whisper of historical lessons surrounds us like a comfortable blanket, offering both entertainment and perhaps a measure of comfort about our own imperfections. These presidential portraits, from the reluctant Buchanan to the brilliant but cantankerous Adams, reveal that even the most powerful office in the world is ultimately filled by humans, with all their accompanying flaws and limitations. The gentle reminder that greatness and failure often coexist in the same individual offers a strangely soothing perspective on leadership. Jackson's democratic vision came packaged with troubling autocracy. Nixon's diplomatic brilliance was undone by personal paranoia. Grant's personal integrity couldn't compensate for his political naivete. The soft rustle of history's pages turning reminds us that complexity, not caricature, defines our leaders. Perhaps there's something reassuring in recognizing that the American experiment has weathered imperfect stewardship and survived. The Republic has endured despite James Buchanan's passivity before Civil War, survived Andrew Johnson's obstruction of Reconstruction, and recovered from Herbert Hoover's mishandling of economic collapse. The gentle resilience of American institutions, despite their flawed caretakers, offers a comforting thought as consciousness begins to fade into dreams. The presidential office itself seems to have a transformative effect, revealing character rather than building it. Those who entered with overconfidence often departed humbled. Those who arrived with rigid ideologies discovered the messy complications of practical governance. The soft ticking of the White House clocks has measured out the education of presidents across centuries, some learning their lessons too late to salvage their place in history. As you drift closer to sleep, consider that these presidential shortcomings might make our own daily struggles seem less consequential by comparison. Few of us will have our errors enshrined in history books, or our misjudgments analyzed by generations of scholars. The gentle recognition that even history's main characters had their bad days offers a peculiar comfort about our own stumbles through life's challenges. The cyclical nature of presidential reputations also suggests the impermanence of judgment. Presidents once dismissed have been reconsidered more generously by history. Others initially celebrated have seen their legacies dimmed by the passage of time and changing values. The soft shifting of historical perspective like sand between fingers reminds us that today's certainties may become tomorrow's questions. Tomorrow, should you remember these bedtime tales of presidential inadequacy, perhaps you'll carry with you a more nuanced view of leadership and human capability. Not the sanitized marble statues of perfection, but the complex, contradictory figures who actually inhabited the office, brilliant but flawed, visionary yet blind in certain aspects, courageous in some matters, and cowardly in others. The gentle recognition of this human complexity might be the most valuable souvenir from our journey through presidential history. So rest now, comfortable in your bed rather than the lonely expanse of the presidential mattress, with its burden of monumental decisions and historic consequences. Be grateful that your errors of judgment rarely trigger constitutional crises or economic depressions. The soft embrace of your pillow carries none of the weight of the presidential seal, no responsibility for the fate of millions. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the Republic has endured despite its imperfect leaders, and will likely survive whoever occupies the office next. Just one final whispered thought before you surrender to slumber. Perhaps the most dangerous president is the one who believes himself immune to the very human limitations we've explored in these stories. The gentle wisdom of history suggests that acknowledging one's capacity for error might be the first requirement for avoiding catastrophic mistakes. Now drift away, dreaming perhaps of marble hallways and oval rooms, grateful that you need only visit them in your imagination rather than bearing their immense responsibility. Good night, and sleep well. No inaugural address will require your attention in the morning.